Professor Elissa. Oh, there we go. Okay, start again. Got it. Today, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Elissa Bemporad to speak on the topic of History is Not Destiny, her thoughts about the Russian war against Ukraine and the Ukraine and the Jewish past in the region. From her extensive research, Elissa is intimately familiar with some of the darkest pages in the history of the Jewish communities in the Ukraine. She's written extensively about the murder of more than 100,000 Jews during the brutal pogroms of the Russian Civil War, as well as the many examples of earlier anti-Jewish violence. Elissa is professor of history and Ungar chair in East European Jewish history and the Holocaust at Queens College and CUNY Graduate Center in New York. She's a two-time winner of the National Jewish Book Award, and she's the author of Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, and Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murders in the Lands of the Soviets. And she's also co-edited 2 volumes, Women and Genocide and Pogroms. And she's currently working on a biography of Esther Frumkin, and I hope she'll tell us a little bit about that later. So we are so privileged to have someone of Professor Bemporad's abilities and knowledge and experience. And please join me in welcoming Professor Elissa Bemporad.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are on planet Earth. Thank you so much to Kolot Mayim Reform Temple for inviting me to share some of my, some of my work and some of my experience and some of my sense of what is happening today in Ukraine with you, as well as thanking in particular Marilyn, who has really done fabulous work in terms of, reaching out, organizing, and of course, I thank all of you for being here today. Okay, so let me begin with the obvious, which is, I want to state the obvious, which is that it would be very wrong for us to superimpose a teleology of violence on the long and rich history of Jewish life on the territory of what is today Ukraine, a history that generated a unique diversity of religious, political, and cultural contributions when we think about Jewish history. A history that was marked significantly more by coexistence between Jews and non-Jews than it was by violence. And I'm saying this not only in response to the genocidal war that Russia has launched against Ukraine, justifying it, among other things, and I'll come back to this later, by manipulating the past and demonizing Ukrainians as quintessentially violent, but also I'm saying this as a reminder, as a Jewish historian, as a reminder that we should resist a teleological view of the Jewish experience in the region. As tragic as it might have been, we should resist this teleological reading of Jewish history in the region, as if it was doomed from the very beginning, enveloped in perpetual violence. Now, before I go back in time, and as you will see, I'm going to shift between the present and the past. I want to start with the present, and then I'll go back to the past, and then I'll come back to the present. So, I hope everybody can stay with me as we travel through time. So I want to begin with a few general remarks about this horrific war of aggression that the Russian Federation has been carrying against Ukraine, which is a genocide. As I said, it has, it is genocidal. The aim of this war, which has triggered, as you all know, of course, I'm just stating the obvious because I know that you all follow, I'm sure that most of you follow what is happening, but it has triggered one of the worst refugee crisis in Europe since World War II, with millions of Ukrainians who fled the country, who have been displaced. Millions of Ukrainian children have been displaced. And the goal of this war seems to be the complete destruction of cities, infrastructure, homes, universities, theaters, hospitals, terrorize indiscriminately the civilian population. Many civilians have been abducted, have been forcibly deported to Russia. And again, the aim of this war seems to be the end, putting an end to Ukrainian sovereignty and identity. Now, as a historian, one of the most painful moments, there are many painful moments, but for me, one of the most painful moments is when I started reading, actually, this was in April, it was rather early on, reading about how the Russian occupiers were seizing and destroying books of history, Ukrainian textbooks of language, history, culture in the cities of Chernihiv, Sumy, Donetsk, Luhansk, in the regions of Lugansk, searching for books that study, Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian past, Ukraine's struggle for independence. And as Jewish historians, we know all too well, or people who read about Jewish history, we know all too well what happens when a society destroys books, right? We know what happens. It's not only about destroying the past, right? It's also about destroying, people. The other comment that I wanted to make, and I'm going to start sharing my screen, and hopefully I can be, a tech savvy. I'm not always, but hopefully I can be tech savvy, is how this war has changed the face of Ukrainian Jewry. How it has changed its demography and its geography. Now, let me see if I can share this. Yes, I'm doing okay, right? Everybody can see. Thumbs up, Marilyn. Okay, perfect. So this is just a map of Ukraine. I'll come back because I'll come back to it in a minute. Well, actually, I can start with it. Here you see Mariupol. I circled the cities that I'm mentioning right now. I'm sure that most of you have followed what happened to Mariupol, where the theater was completely destroyed, and many children were and civilians, of course, were hiding on the site of the theater. Mariupol has had a Jewish community that was largely decimated during World War II, but not entirely. I mean, there was I can't tell you exactly how many Jews were members of the Jewish community of Mariupol before February 24th, but this is what happened to the synagogue, the building of the synagogue of Mariupol, after Russia attacked Ukraine. And it's ironic to see this image, right? When Putin claims that by attacking Ukraine, he is actually ridding the country of Nazis, right? But you see the result, which is the destruction of this building. And here I'm showing you the historic building of the Mariupol synagogue from the 19th century. It's a rather recent, not a very old Jewish community in Ukraine. There's some that are much older. But as you can imagine, all those Jews or most of the members of the Jewish community have left the city. The same with the city of Kharkiv, which is, to go back to my map, Kharkiv is right here, and I circled Kharkiv. It's close to the border with Russia. This was the building of the Hillel, which was a rather new building that had been sponsored by the Jewish community, also, abroad, and it was it was flourishing. It was, attracting many students. Here you have one of the students who used to attend the Hillel chapter, and he was killed early on in the war. He was killed. Serafim was killed in April, in early April. Here you have the largest Jewish community center in the world, which is located in the city of Dnipro. Today it's called Dnipro. where's my cursor right here? Dnipropetrovsk is the more Russian name, but today it's called Dnipro. It's right here. This community center has not been destroyed, has not been actually affected in any way by the attack, by the bombings. But it's impressive that this is the largest community center in the world. And here you have the synagogue in Dnipro. And most of the Jews in the city of Dnipro, Kharkiv, Mariupol have left these cities. And we don't know if they're going to return to these cities. So this is why I'm mentioning the fact that the war has changed the face of Ukrainian Jewry. Here I'm just showing you this. Maybe you've seen it already. It's a father and a son. The father is a Hasid, and they both fight in the Ukrainian army, but they're both, observant Jews. And they are both, fighting to protect their country. So, again, the main point is that the Jews of these communities have either fled to Israel or they have resettled to the West. So this is how, these communities that were, rather thriving, I would say, Kharkiv, Mariupol, Dnipro, some Jews have moved to Kiev, but most of them have moved, as you can see here, I circled the city of Lviv and the city of Chernivtsi. So they have resettled there, if they have not left the country entirely. And here I just wanted to show you this image, also the impact of this, the destruction of the electrical power plants, and the lack of water in some places and heating, even in the capital city of Kiev, which of course has the largest, Jewish community. And here I'm showing you some images of older members of the Jewish community in Kiev, the conservative Jewish community, who are coming together and without light, without electricity, but they're coming together to to observe the Sabbath. So now this was, just very quickly, the present. I want to go back to the past, and I want to remind you of numbers. We have, before World War II, 1.5 million Jews lived in what is today Ukraine. The largest Jewish community was in Kiev. 226,000 Jews lived in Kiev, 1/3 of the population. But I'm showing you here Berdichev. I don't know how many of you have heard of Berdichev, which is also known as a Jewish mega shtetl. But in fact, it was a city, but it was 80% of the population was Jewish. And so here you see in the background, this kind of greenish building is the synagogue. There were 50,000 Jews who lived in Berdichev. Okay. And now I want to, really talk about the past and talk about anti-Jewish violence, because I think it's something that we need to talk about. And without falling into this teleology of violence, but as a historian who recognizes the importance of studying it, I'd like to talk about the violence of the Russian Civil War. The epicenter of the Civil War was Ukraine. This Civil War took place between 1918 and 1921. And I will do that. First, I'll give you a sense of the Civil War, and then I will zoom in on one voice, one woman. She was a writer, and she was she produced very powerful accounts of this violence. Her name is Rochel Feigenberg. I will show you a slide later with the name in case you're interested in her. And then once I talk about this violence, I'm going to go back to, talk a little bit about the memory of this violence, and then I will conclude with some thoughts about contemporary Ukraine. Okay, so let me go over the nuts and bolts of the events in Ukraine, 1918 to 1921. In the wake of World War I and shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, we have a violent war that erupts in the eastern territories of the European continent, present-day Ukraine, but also in Belarus and in southern Russia, between different armies and forces that represent different geopolitical goals. The Ukrainian armed forces fight against the Red Army, against Soviet power, and they want independence. They're fighting for the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic, which is established in December 1917. The Red Army is waging a war for the victory of Bolshevism and is trying to control the territory of the former Tsarist Empire, which includes Ukraine. And then you have other enemies of Soviet power, which include different armed formations. You have the White Movement. The political and territorial goal of the white troops is the return of the Tsar, the return of autocracy to the Tsarist Empire, and the defeat of Bolshevism. And then you have the Polish troops that are fighting for they're fighting on behalf of the Second Polish Republic. They're fighting against the Red Army. They want to maintain their independence. And, you know, this chapter is known as the Polish-Soviet War. And then, of course, you have, in addition to the military forces involved, you have a diverse group of anarchist peasant bands and thousands of civilians who join the fighting. Most often they're swayed by the desperate socioeconomic conditions of war, famine in the region, and World War I since 1914. And they're responding to this appeal of looting. So they're driven very often more by despair than by political allegiance. Now, most troops and military units involved in the conflict perpetrated atrocities against the Jewish population. And the pogrom, this, ethnic violence against Jews, became unprecedented both in nature and in scale. And I'm showing you here some quotes. The pogroms were both military, but they also included the participation of neighbors, as war, famine, shortage of food led neighbors to turn against neighbors and participate in the looting and killing of their Jewish neighbors. You have approximately 1,500 pogroms that were carried out in more than 800 towns and shtetls, most of them located in Ukraine. As many as 150,000 Jews die as a result of this violence. And the motivation for the violence vastly differed. Again, as I said, desperate conditions of war encouraged soldiers and local peasants to loot Jewish communities. For many political and military leaders on all sides, there was a stereotype of Jewish disloyalty towards the Ukrainian dream of nationhood and independence, towards, the Polish nation state, or the Russian version of this revitalized empire. And this all intersected with this, exclusivist nationalism that peaks during World War I, and with the fear of Bolshevism. And Jews are thought of as these interlopers in the national body of these, of the Poles, Ukrainians, or Russians, and are imagined as forces connected to Bolshevism and that tear apart the nation's fabric. And of course, in many ways, this constitutes a continuation of pre-1917 Tsar's rhetoric on Jewish radicalism. Now, Ukraine is the center stage, the main stage of the battlefront. Here, where all forces clash in combat and where one of the largest Jewish communities in Europe had lived and thrived for centuries. Now, to be sure, anti-Jewish violence had disrupted the lives, and I mentioned it earlier in my opening remarks, had disrupted the lives of Jews living in the cities and towns of Ukraine time and again since the 17th century. Historically, the violence occurred on the backdrop of political upheaval and socioeconomic tensions and was reinforced by pre-existing class tensions and religious stereotypes. But it often found its main source in the divergence between Jewish and Ukrainian political strategies and goals. Jews were a despised minority and could not create their own army. So what did they do? They looked for protection. They needed protection and sought it from the existing power, usually the nobility, the king, and they forged what historian Yosef Yerushalmi has called the royal alliance, right? So they side with the highest authority, which promised protection, and this became the Jewish community's survival strategy. However, this alliance between Jews and the centers of power was very often at odds with Ukrainians' political goals. Ukrainians created armies and fought for independence against these centers of power. So the lack of common political goals fostered these horizontal tensions and clashes between Jews and their neighbors, yielding some tragic consequences. During 1648, you have the Cossack uprising against Polish rule in Ukraine, and Bogdan Khmelnytsky's forces carried out anti-Jewish massacres, primarily because they identified Jews as allies of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and enemies of the Cossacks. The same political dynamic that pitted Jewish and Ukrainian political objectives against each other was at play 1 century later during the 1768 rebellion of Ukrainian peasants and Cossacks against, again, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, led by Ivan Honta, and I'm showing you here an image, who headed the massacre of thousands of Jews in Uman in retaliation, again, for their alliance with the Polish forces. So these real or imagined divergent political interests promoted resentment, encouraged violence against Jewish communities during the later pogroms in the 1880s and early 1900s, many of which took place in Ukraine. But it was really the Russian Civil War that I just told you about that brought these differences to the fore in a new and critical way. The roughly 1.5 million Jews who lived on the territories of Ukraine on the eve of World War I were not merely passive victims of violence, right? Many, especially the younger ones, who became politicized through Zionism or socialism, took sides during the war. To some extent, Jews participated on all sides of the conflict, with some very few, however, even joining the White Army led by General Denikin. By and large, at least at the beginning of the conflict, I would say, many Jews chose to support the Ukrainian national movement against Soviet power. And many young Zionist and Bundist activists selected to fight on behalf of Ukraine, on behalf of the Central Rada of Ukraine, the political body of the Ukraine's People's Republic that existed from 1917 to 1918. But everything changes in 1919 as the violence against the Jewish population intensifies. More and more communal leaders and political activists shift their allegiance and seek the protection from the Red Army, from Soviet power, which killed less Jews than other armies, or actually stopped killing them altogether by the end of 1918, as even the staunchest anti-Bolsheviks turned into supporters of Soviet power, and often their choice was the lesser of two evils. As you can see here from the slide that I'm showing you, it was a reluctant choice to side with the Reds, but it still prompted a vicious circle or a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? The more they supported the Reds, the Jews, the more the Jews supported the Reds, the more Ukrainian forces that were led by Simon Petliura, and I'll show you an image of him later, came to resent Jews for this alleged lack of loyalty to Ukraine and pro-communist position, carrying out many pogroms. The fact that there were rumors of Bolsheviks led by Jewish socialists and anti-Semitic stereotypes reinforced this. The fact that Leon Trotsky, and you can see here some anti-communist caricature that was produced at the time, the fact that Trotsky was the leader of the Red Army did not play in favor of the Jews, who came again to be identified as this compromised political actor. And the success with which the white forces in particular weaponized the discourse of Jewish communism, of Judeo-Bolshevism, and again, these two posters are an example of that, through systematic propaganda, influenced Ukrainian troops and neighbors into seeing Jews as a threat to the Ukrainian dream of independence. So the more Petliura, the leader of Ukraine, resorted to this kind of pogrom politics, which was this tactic to bond the troops against a common enemy, to struggle against Bolshevik forces, the more Jews who had championed the Ukrainian forces and the idea of independent Ukraine embraced the Red Army, some grudgingly, some enthusiastically, but you see that it's almost an impossible situation. Anyway, I got drawn into this chaos, the epicenter of which is Ukraine, by this writer, Rachel Feigenberg. In a way, I hold her responsible. And I thought that I would talk a little bit about her and her work. She's, she's largely a marginal voice today, especially when we think about the study of anti-Jewish violence, but she's a central voice at the time of the events. In fact, it wasn't by chance that the great historian of Ukrainian Jewry at the time, and I'm showing you here an image of him, Elias Cherikover, he actually turned to her at the time of the pogroms. He said, he gave her an assignment to write reports about the destruction of small Jewish settlements, some of which were completely wiped off the map of Ukraine, conscious of the fact that unlike previous waves of anti-Jewish violence during the Civil War, the Ukrainian shtetl became the epicenter of the pogrom. And this was an assignment that Rachel Feigenberg took very seriously, also as a result of the fact that she herself experienced the violence. And I'm showing her here with her newborn son, with whom she managed to flee, to go into hiding during the pogroms of the Civil War. So in 1922, actually, after Cherikover left Ukraine, he collects these accounts about the pogroms, then he flees with the documents to Berlin. In 1922, Cherikover receives the accounts that this woman, that Rachel Feigenberg, wrote, and he adds her account to the thousands of original records, testimonies, photographs of these bloody pogroms. And what he receives is this. This is the account of the destruction of one shtetl, the shtetl of Dubovo. You see it right here that she wrote. She wrote, the title of this is in English, Chronicle of a Dead, the Destruction of Dubove, Chronicle of a Dead City. And it is based on interviews with refugees that she met in Odessa. And here you can read what she says. After she flees, she manages to leave her shtetl. She reaches Odessa, and here she interviews Jewish refugees who also experience this violence. And based on these interviews, she wrote the accounts that she then sent to Cherikover. And this account that she wrote, that I just showed you here, this is the archival document that she put together. She sent it to, I'm sorry, let me stay on this actually on this one. She sent it to Berlin, but it's so powerful that it was used during the sensational Schwarzbard murder trial in Paris in 1927. For those of you who don't know about this trial, this is when the young Ukrainian Jew Sholem Schwarzbard assassinated Petliura in revenge for the pogrom. Petliura, again, is the leader of the Ukrainian forces, and he assassinated him in Paris. Petliura had fled the Soviet Union. He had fled to Paris. Schwarzbard is in Paris, and he assassinates him, and there's this big trial that was extensively covered, even by the New York Times, by the way. And during the trial, the account that Feigenberg wrote was used and was even translated into French. And eventually, Sholem Schwarzbard is acquitted. Although he does not apologize. He says, "I did kill Petliura because of the pogroms." Anyway, her voice and of Rochel Feigenberg really allows us to grasp some of the aspects of this violence that took place on the territory of Ukraine. She helps us expand our understanding of the human dimension of these pogroms. What I'm showing you here is the book that was published in 1926 based on her account. It has the same title as the archival, as the original document. And she focuses, for example, on the Jewish home, what happened to the Jewish home at the time of these pogroms, on how violence influences everyday life and how it really changed the neighborly relations, and how it also reshaped the future life choices of many of the victims. It was also translated into Russian in 1928, and it is a very, very powerful account. She also reminds us in this, and I'm actually going to leave you with this the photograph of what is left of the shtetl of Dubove, actually of the Jewish cemetery, which was, after the Jewish population was killed, it was completely destroyed. But in this account, she reminds us how the homes of non-Jewish neighbors could also offer refuge and protection during these pogroms. After all, as I mentioned earlier, it was coexistence and not violence that had been the constant marker of relations between Jews and non-Jews in any town of Ukraine over the centuries. So these stories of cooperation and suspension of violence are not always easy to recover. More often than not, witness accounts and survivor testimonies tend to focus on the details of betrayal, right? On those neighbors who took part in the looting and the killing, understandably so, rather than on the instances in which neighbors provided assistance to their Jewish neighbors during the pogroms. Of course, the trauma of death and loss could skew the memory of the experience of the pogroms, inspiring victims to remember or to report only those instances in which they were denied refuge by their neighbors, and maybe forget or choose to silence those cases in which the home of strangers became a site of rescue. Cellars or attics became spaces of shelter, and she does mention these cases. Now, Feigenberg, as I mentioned, records her own journey as she fled the violence, as she fled in haste. Actually, let me go back to this slide where she is with her son, and she manages to flee thanks to the neighbors. She survived thanks to peasants in nearby villages who took her and her newborn son into their homes. She does not describe these homes and does not reveal the peasants' identities, perhaps because at the time she perceived their behavior as exceptional. But she acknowledged, for example, one woman who saved her by helping her mask her Jewish identity. This woman gave her a traditional folk dress and a little cross to put around her child's neck to disguise him as a Christian boy. So in a way, the woman who provided assistance to Feigenberg did so by bequeathing her with a piece of her home, right? We can assume that the dress and the cross were not only closely connected to her ethno-national identity, but also to the history and memory of her home. So these were personal items that were shared with a Jewish woman and her son. And in turn, in order to save herself and her son, Feigenberg took with her a piece of the woman's home. So this is an example, I think, of coexistence. Feigenberg's powerful accounts of anti-Jewish violence in Ukraine at the time also confirmed the role that gender played in dictating the suspension of violence. It was much easier for women to find a refuge in the homes of their neighbors. Neighbors often offered support and care to women and children more than to Jewish men. So it's much easier to hide, just like, you know, it was to some degree during the Holocaust. It was easier to hide among neighbors, disguising one's identity in order to escape the violence for Jewish women than it was for men. In the shtetl of Dubove, for example, she mentions a Ukrainian neighbor who offered refuge to many Jewish women and children. In exchange for personal objects, a value, but many widows and orphans took refuge, found refuge in his home. And as one refugee interviewed by Feigenberg noted, his home became an exhibit of Jewish furniture and objects, meaning that in exchange for that, he gave them refuge. And the Dubove peasants called him the Jewish father, a Jewish bachko, the Jewish father. The last point that I want to make is that this chronicle by Feigenberg also sheds light on some of the choices that Jews made in response to the pogroms. Witnessing and experiencing the violence had long-term consequences for generations of younger Jews who lived in Ukraine, galvanizing some political choices spanning from communism to Zionism, and in some cases triggered the desire for revenge. In others, they influenced the relations with the local population and with state authority. In many cases, it really triggered migration from the smaller shtetls to the larger cities, like in this case, you know, from Dubove to Odessa or to Kiev, but also to Moscow and to Petrograd, or which would become Leningrad, but also external migration, Europe, America, Palestine. One survivor in the Dubove massacre, his name is Moshe Schwarzman, refused to remain in Dubove, although many of his neighbors wanted him to stay because he was the most skilled wheelwright. So they wanted him to stay, but he said, I cannot stay. I want to move to Odessa, where Russians and Ukrainians will be ashamed to carry out pogroms. This is, I'm quoting from Feigenberg. When Feigenberg survived her near-to-death experience of the pogroms, and she fled to Odessa, she wrote about her small town home in the shtetl where she lived, a space that she remembered warmly with nostalgia. This was a space where she prepared the food for the Jewish holidays, where she marinated the squash and the pickles and the tomatoes. But she, she could not return to this space, the space that was marked by the quotidian, that was connected to the preparation of food. She could not return to it because it was completely destroyed. Her home was destroyed. The home was demolished. So she would not return to the shtetl. She would not move to a larger city in Ukraine like Odessa. She would not move to Moscow. She, together with thousands of others, actually reached the Romanian border and then moved to Poland. And then from Poland, she reached Palestine. But she did not relinquish the memory of these pogroms. Actually, this memory resurfaced with renewed power during World War II. And I'm showing you here, she herself translated into Hebrew. You know, she moved to Palestine. She switched from Yiddish to Hebrew, and she translated these accounts of the pogroms of the Civil War into Hebrew in 1940 and in 1943, and eventually published a book later after World War II about these accounts. Okay. Let me now dwell on the question of this politics of memory. And I want to say that there are continuities between Russia's distortion of history and the Soviet politics of memory with regard to the memory of this violence that I just described and detailed for you. And this is a reminder, I'm saying this as a reminder of a deep ambivalence that the Soviet state had towards anti-Semitism and towards condemning anti-Semitism, which is connected to what Putin is doing today, I would say. While the state condemned on paper anti-Semitism, it was often eager to ignore anti-Semitism or to weaponize it in its best interest. So with regard to the pogroms that I just described, the Soviets shifted between acknowledging and downplaying anti-Jewish violence. And they were ambiguous in their treatment of the perpetrators, creating a state-controlled memory and narrative. So here I'm showing you Trostinets, which is near the city of Vinica, a small shtetl. You see how it was, destroyed during the pogroms. And here I'm showing you a memorial. This is a memorial that the Soviet state put up after it liberated the shtetl from Ukrainian forces. And the inscription is very interesting. You can maybe see how on the right-hand side it's in Yiddish, and on the left-hand side it's in Russian. And it reads very clearly, "Here rest 337 Jews of Trostinets who were brutally murdered in May 1919 by the enemies of the Soviet state." So the message conveyed to anyone who passed by this memorial was very clear. The Soviet state commemorated, remembered, and guarded Jews against anti-Jewish violence and knew very well who the enemies were, right? Ukrainians. Now, when the discussion of the pogroms, and here you see how immense this memorial is, when the discussion of the pogroms was perceived as at odds with the regime's interest and priorities of building socialism based on the brotherhood of peoples, then the memory of anti-Jewish violence was silenced. Victims are universalized, and the Soviets preferred not to investigate and punish the perpetrators. We have many trials in 1923, 1924 of those who carried out this violence, who are either not punished in the end, or whose crimes of killing Jews are not mentioned in the verdicts. So this is this tendency to kind of downplay the importance of this violence on the part of the state. On the other hand, the Soviet state could use these pogroms and the memory of these pogroms to advance its own interests. One of these interests being countering Ukrainian nationalism or Ukraine's desire for independence, identifying it as a national threat for the Soviet Union. So, for example, at the time Oh, actually, I wanted to show you also the image of this memorial that still stands today. And you can see how big it is. This is Simon Petliura. So an example of of the way in which the Soviet state exploited this memory at the time of the 1926 trial against Sholem Schwarzbard that I mentioned earlier, who assassinated Petliura, who you see here. At this time, and again, Petliura had moved to Paris, where he was the leader of the Ukrainian government in exile. When Schwarzbard carries out this act of assassinates Petliura, the Soviet press wildly covers the events and collects documents to prove Petliura's responsibility for the pogroms, and sends these documents to Paris to use as evidence in the trial. And as I said, this trial is covered extensively in the Soviet press. Here, I'm showing you as an example. Schwarzbard is this the man at the center with the mustache. But the state also used this trial as a pretext to carry out systematic campaign against Ukrainian nationalism and its leaders. This campaign reemerges with force in 1929, when the Soviet secret police arrested the members of the underground Ukrainian organizations for allegedly conspiring against the Soviet Union on behalf of Ukrainian independence. So the preoccupation with Petliura was ideologically straightforward and allowed the Soviets to accomplish their objective, which was it confirmed the wickedness of the political enemy embodied by Ukrainian nationalism, allowing them to purge Ukrainians in Soviet Ukraine, including people that had nothing to do with Petliura, and that had not supported Petliura and that had not carried out any kind of violence. Let me move to present day, the present day. And I think, let us think about the memory of these pogroms and anti-Jewish violence today. Now, without doubt, the war launched by Russia against Ukraine, that, as most of you know, goes back to 2014, unleashed, understandably, this wave of nationalist sentiment. You have, in many places across Ukraine, the renaming of streets and even memorial events for Petliura. Here you see this this mural in the city of Vinnytsia. So there is a kind of a public rehabilitation of Petliura. In 2016, for the first time, the country observed a minute of silence in memory of Petliura to mark the 90th anniversary of Petliura's assassination in Paris that I talked about earlier. And again, as a freedom fighter for the Ukrainian people, Petliura is generally not held accountable for anti-Jewish violence. He is he's remembered as someone who fought against Soviet power, not as someone who also is responsible for anti-Jewish violence. So it's definitely very complicated. And certainly, in general, glorifying a hero rarely fits together with vilifying the hero, right? In national histories, in national memories, glorification and vilification never go together, right? Meaning that the identity of a hero rarely conflates with that of a perpetrator. In 2005, on the initiative of Putin, the remains of, here I'm showing you again another, statue of Petliura. But in 2005, on the initiative of Putin, the remains of General Anton Denikin who was responsible for some of the most brutal pogroms against Jews during the civil war on Ukrainian territory. General Denikin, as I mentioned earlier, is the leader of the White Movement. So on the initiative of Putin, the remains of the general were returned to Moscow and buried in the cemetery of the Donskoy Monastery, which is one of the most important sites in terms of, memory of heroes in the Russian Federation. And Putin laid flowers on the Moscow grave of the white Russian leader in 2009. And sanctioned him as a symbol of the indivisibility of Russia, confirming a trend to glorify the past through the restoration of this forgotten national hero, who was a pogromchik, who carried out pogroms. And so the pogromist Denikin is turned into a national hero and into the guardian of Russian patriotism. Marilyn, do I still have a few minutes? Or should I stop?
We have about 2 minutes left. So if you could wrap things up, that would be great.
Wonderful. 2 minutes left. Here, by the way, I'm showing you, this is from the Pew Research Center in terms, again, you've all heard of the way in which Putin and the Russian Federation have exploited this idea of, anti-Semitic, denazifying. Their goal is to denazify Ukraine. Ukraine as the center of anti-Semitism, and you can see here, you can compare the percentage of anti-Semitism in different countries in Europe. So, to conclude, and I don't want to, get into too many details, but of the present day situation, but I would say that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in general, Ukraine, has become the most democratic state in the post-Soviet landscape, if we, without considering Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, without considering the Baltic states. It has become the most, with all its problems in terms of corruption and so on, it has become the most, the most successful post-Soviet democratic state, and I would say that it has also begun to witness a new chapter in Ukrainian Jewish relations. I won't state the obvious, the fact that we have a Jewish president who was elected with almost 73% of the votes, which is extraordinary and unthinkable in any other country in Eastern Europe. In Poland, impossible. In the Baltic states, impossible. In Russia, let's not even begin. In many other countries in Europe. So it's very interesting that there's this new chapter. Thanks to him, there also is a law against anti-Semitism now in Ukraine. This law passed after he was elected. There is also this, this new complex that is being finally created at the site of Babi Yar, where more than 33,000 Jews were killed in 1941 by the Germans and their collaborators during World War II. So I think that there's, I am cautiously optimistic. Well, I would say I am optimistic that, that also as a Jewish historian, I feel very comfortable saying that I support Ukraine today, despite the violence that I just described to you, that I'm not silencing or marginalizing in any way, but that I support Ukraine today. And my support of Ukraine does not mean that I'm dismissing these dark pages in the past of in the relations between Jews and Ukrainians in the past. And I just want to close with I want to leave you with the words of my favorite writer, Vasily Grossman, who's Ukrainian born. He was born in Berdichev. Remember, I showed you the image of the mega shtetl earlier. He's a wonderful writer. You see him here on the left-hand side with his mother, who was killed by the Germans in Berdichev in 1941. He survived the war. He wrote about the war. He wrote about the Holocaust, and he wrote a lot about the totalitarian system. And I want to leave us with the words of Vasily Grossman, who asks us in his magisterial novel, which is called Life and Fate, that if you haven't read, I would highly recommend it. He asks us, what is his solution in the totalitarian regime? And he suggests that to witness and to speak the truth to power, to resist the state's language, to wrest language away from the regime, is to resist the dehumanizing aspects of totalitarian control. As Russia is moving toward totalitarian fascist leadership, I think it is our responsibility to follow, to listen to the words of Vasily Grossman, a Ukrainian Jew who witnessed and paid the price of experiencing his life in the totalitarian system. He says that we must speak truth to power. And so it is, I feel at least that it's my responsibility as a Jewish historian to speak truth to power and resist and reject this imagined truth, this artificial truth that is not truth, that the Russian Federation is, has been forging, has been putting together in order to justify this war. And on that note, I finished. I completed my my talk. So let me stop sharing my PowerPoint.
Oh, Elissa, that was